Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I have some very interesting news I want to cover today. There was an interesting revelation kind of buried in a CNN article. I haven't really seen anybody else covering or touching on, so I would like to do that now. But before I get into it, I just want to say if you're new here, welcome to the channel. I hope you subscribe, and if you like the video, please hit the like button, leave a comment, share it with somebody you know. All of that stuff helps boost us in the algorithm. Okay, so this article came out a few days ago. The Fed is secretly stress testing the US economy against nightmare scenarios. Now, looking at the headline, you wouldn't really think that there was anything particularly interesting in this article. It kind of makes, you would assume that that's what's happening, right? So I want to go ahead and read part of this because there's some interesting things like buried in here that, well, I think are quite obvious, but we'll get into that. So Jerome Powell went to a European Central Bank conference in Portugal, and he sat with a panel of people. And when asked how the Fed plans for the worst case scenarios on the geopolitical front, he first responded in Fedspeak, quote, "We use our tools to achieve our legal mandates," he said. But when pushed, he opened up about a top secret Federal Reserve tool, the Teal Book. So I've never heard of the Teal Book before, but I find it very interesting, and you guys should too. You should know about it if it has such bearing on our policy. At every Fed policy meeting, he said, quote, "Our staff works up 6 or 7 or 8 alternative simulations." He said all the participants read those and think about them and talk about them. It's helpful because you can't get too focused on the modal paths in a world where it's very hard to predict the economy. So they're running sort of like war game simulations, right? They're simulating different scenarios and trying to prepare plans for how they would handle them, or at least that's what they say. And that is interesting because it reminds me of things that were happening on 9/11. Everybody remembers the war games that were going on with NATO, while they were like war games for that type of scenario as the scenario was happening, and people didn't know if it was real or a simulation, which I just find very interesting. What would happen to the economy in an oil crisis if US-China tensions accelerate, or if there's another pandemic that shuts down the economy? The Federal Reserve officials might know, or at least they think they do. Every year, the Fed performs stress tests to examine what the nation's biggest banks to examine whether the nation's biggest banks can withstand a severe economic crisis. It's interesting, right? Because what about Silicon Valley Bank and all of the recent bank failures? I mean, I'm pretty sure they passed these quote unquote stress tests. So just keep that in mind. Every 6 weeks, the central bank also secretly stress tests its own policy decisions, assessing how interest rate hikes would stand up against a bevy of economic, geopolitical, and other exogenous situations. Think global pandemic. Policymakers rarely discuss this exercise. The data and conversations about it are considered classified information and are kept private for 5 years. Even when they're released, certain parts of the discussion are blacked out, but they're immensely important in guiding Fed decisions. And also remember that the Federal Reserve isn't federal and it has no reserves. Quote, "If one wondered how the Fed responded in near real time during the great financial crisis, or during our more recent pandemic era crisis with very innovative policy responses, it's due to the systematic work on crisis response around a wide variety of scenarios and simulations conducted by the central bank," said Joe Brusales, chief economist at RSM. Quote, this is where it gets interesting coming up. Quote, They are carefully managed within the bank leadership and provide insight into policy options for the Fed under an array of various shocks that range from domestic financial crises to external events such as an oil crisis caused by conflict in the Middle East, he added. Now, this is very interesting because you could say that the Fed didn't have a good response to the great financial crisis. They may have caused it. They certainly didn't have a great response to the pandemic. Shutting down the global economy, oh, that only benefited a handful of people. Yeah, not most people. Bloomberg called Stacy Tevlin the woman in charge of the Fed's Teal Book. So you should know her name. Quote, the most important person in U.S. economics that you've probably never heard of. That's what Bloomberg says about this woman. Well, now you've heard of her. In a rare interview with the outlet last year, she gave some insight into modeling the scenarios that affect the trajectory of monetary policy. Quote, there is definitely a lot of judgment we are imposing on this, she said. Quote, we don't think people will react exactly as they have in the past. We have a lot of debates on this as a staff. So these are the people who, again, are not elected. They're not elected to the government. They are not elected representatives of the American people, but these are the individuals who are essentially guiding the nation because everything comes from their money. If they don't have money, they can't operate as a government, and they know that. During the height of the pandemic, for example, her team presented policymakers with forecasts for both the course of the virus and vaccine availability to help them aid their decisions. So they are giving politicians information and telling them how to craft policy. The policy scenarios created by the Fed are quite sensitive. Now, here is where it gets amazing, because I believe this to be a subtle admission here. It says, quote, imagine how the market would have reacted if it knew that former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke was gaming out a financial crisis due to the housing sector back in 2005, says Brusales. So I want people to understand what they just said there. What that is telling us is that, and I think everybody that is at least a listener of my channel, this won't come as a surprise to you. It seems like, oh, they were lying, when they said no one could have foreseen the subprime mortgage crisis. No one could have foreseen the 2008 economic collapse. Oh, really? Not only did Michael Burry foresee it and made a bunch of money on it, watch The Big Short if you haven't. He had been warning people, other people saw it coming. And what it is interesting to me is if Ben Bernanke was doing that in 2005, you might be asking yourself, why did 2008 happen? Almost as if it happened on purpose as a massive consolidation of power and massive transfer of wealth. And what happened with the pandemic? Another massive transfer of wealth. And this time, not just going after Main Street, but now going after small businesses. And so we still haven't seen all of the consequences from that. The supply chain disruptions, the inflation, remember, is a soft tax. So it's this to me is very telling and very disgusting. And who knows the kind of data analytics, AI, etc., that the Federal Reserve has, the kind of proprietary tools that give them the ability to run these scenarios, to predict what's going to happen, to possibly make things happen that benefit a small class of people, and you are not one of them. The Fed releases its economic projections to the public in a form of a dot plot 4 times a year, but there's so much that we don't see, says Philippa Dunn of TLR Analytics. Exactly. Teal Books and transcripts from 2017, these are the most recent that have been released, show Fed members openly discussing how they feel about the ramifications of ongoing political issues. Quote, it's too bad they don't release these in real time, she said. Yeah. And there are some discussions they're never going to release. You'll never know about it because they happen in closed doors with small groups of people, little powerful clubs of internationalists, and you're not one of them. Still, the Fed relies on its status as an independent agency, not subject to political oversight, says Danielle DiMartino Booth, CEO and chief strategist at QI Research and a former Fed economist. Quote, if some senator was able to see how the Fed was making decisions about inflation in real time, then they could theoretically attack them, she said. Oh, so they could criticize their policies before those policies have negative consequences. So that's likely why Powell, when asked about the scenarios the Fed had most recently considered, stayed mum. Quote, I'm going to leave that to your imagination, he said. Oh, very, very interesting. And it says this is Bidenomics, folks. This is a thing that they've been trying to make a thing, this Bidenomics. It's silly. Meet Bidenomics, which President Joe Biden formally introduced to the U.S. on Wednesday as, quote, growing the economy from the middle out and the bottom up, not the top down. That is an absolute lie. This isn't trickle-down Reaganomics, folks. Okay, CNN. Bidenomics is about the future, Biden said during a speech in Chicago Wednesday. Bidenomics is just another way of saying restore the American dream. Oh, please. The economy's track record under Biden is a mixed bag, according to my colleagues Elizabeth Buchwald and Brian Mina. Even CNN journalists are having to admit that Bidenomics is horrific. Americans have grappled with high inflation rates for more than a year, including painfully unaffordable housing, as the Fed raises interest rates 10 times in a row to bring that inflation down. In addition, a tight labor market has left many small businesses with ongoing hiring difficulties. In anticipation of a recession, which they're saying is coming at the end of this year, large companies have tightened their belts, resized their workforce, laying off thousands of workers. But it hasn't been all bad, they say. Oh, thank you, CNN. I'm glad for your kind. It hasn't been so bad. But let's just remind people of what Ben Bernanke told us way back in the day. Quote, we do not expect significant spillovers from the subprime market to the rest of the economy or financial system. Oh, really? Oh, really, Ben? You and your in the Teal Book at the Fed, you guys weren't wargaming these scenarios 3 years before it happened? Oh, and then you said, oh, no one could have seen that this would happen. Oh, it's not going to be bad. Oh, really? Because it's like you designed it to crash this way. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Let's not forget. Let us not forget who these people are and what they've done. And remember, the Fed was created on Jekyll Island with a bunch of creeps. They represent international banking interests. They do not represent you. It was a total takeover of the financial system. Most of our founding fathers did not want a federal central bank. And there are many reasons for that. So I just thought this was interesting. I don't think anybody here is surprised that they knew 2008 was going to happen years before it happened and probably made it happen so they could consolidate more wealth and power. That's what they do. And it appears they're doing it again. So anyways, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. Did this come as a surprise to anybody? Have y'all heard of the Teal Book before? And also, if you haven't watched it, I did a video called Ode to the Bankers, which is, I'll include in the video description. If you haven't watched it, it's just kind of a sort of more like an artistic video I made talking about 2008. I think you guys would appreciate. Anyways, I hope you guys have a good day. I'll talk to you later.